Sanam Imtiaz, and I'm assistant professor in urogynecology. Uh, this lecture has been made by somebody else since it's provided, so I'm sorry I haven't been able to make correction and go through it. Anyway, the simple, we're just going to discuss gynae history taking format. So basically, when we start with any history, I think I've already discussed yesterday the principles of history taking and the importance of taking history and how you should greet yourself, introduce yourself. These are the basics, and you should always follow this, especially in your OSCE exams, because these are all points that you will be numbered for. So don't miss out on them. Don't miss out on them ever, ever, ever. Okay. So this is again, the data is more or less the same when it comes to gynae history. It's more like name, age, the marital status of the patient, husband's occupation, address, the mode of the admission if the patient is admitted, and an inpatient number if the patient is admitted again. And if not admitted, then you just have to check if the patient has presented in OPD. These are simple things which you already know. They're applicable to every kind of history taking format. The diagnosis made by listening to the patient while she's telling her story, generating a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis by interrogation, by examination, and by selective testing. Try again. So if you'd say major hypothesis in gynecology, it's basically like what are the most common differentials that you'd have in your mind. It can be reproductive tract dysfunction like dysmenorrhea, dysfunctional uterine bleeding, functional ovarian cysts, endometriosis, pregnancy. If it's related to pregnancy, could be a miscarriage, could be an ectopic, could be any other pregnancy-related diseases, could be reproductive tract infections like vaginitis, PID, reproductive tract cancer like cervix, uterus, ovaries, benign tumors of fibroids, polyps, cervix, ovarian, or prolapse like UV prolapse. And UV prolapse can present with urinary bowel dysfunction. The other possibilities or differentials that the patient might be presenting to you could be psychosexual, pelvic pain, dyspareunia, vaginismus, sexual assault, decreased libido, homosexuality, or iatrogenic arising from COCs, HRT, anything secondary to all these things. Other diseases with pelvic manifestations could be maybe secondary meds, or could be something of that. So like a pelvic TB, chest TB, and then following with pelvic TB. Infertility again. Okay, so what is now the history taking is starting. Okay, so what's the components of the gynae history taking? Menstrual history, contraceptive history, obstetric history. When you're taking the gynae history, then obstetric history is more or less very brief. All you need to know is what is the parity and the mode of delivery, if there were any complications that happened during the pregnancies and the postpartum period, if the patient had been lactating the babies, or was she on any kind of contraception, all these things. In obstetric history, you don't have to get into the details of the chronological order and you have to write in details, kahan, kab, kaise, that's not required when you talk about gynae history. Then history of presenting complaint, we all know that sexual history, past gynecological and other medical history, past surgical history, family and social history, drug history, personal history, blood and bowel dysfunction, socioeconomic history. So all these are general things. So now coming to menstrual history. What is important in menstrual history? First, menarche. What is menarche? Menarche is the age of the onset of menses. And so that's basically menarche. So you have to always ask what was the age of onset of menses, because somebody can have primary amenorrhea or secondary amenorrhea. The age of menarche is very important. Then the cycles. In cycles, you need to express the regularity of the cycles and the amount of the bleeding, normal, moderate, severe. And it is usually expressed in the form like days of bleeding upon the days of the duration between the two cycles. So that's a total cycle. Then LMP, again, like yesterday I told you, it's the first day of your last menstrual period. Intermenstrual bleeding is when a woman would bleed between two menstrual cycles. When otherwise her cycles are regular, but between the two cycles she's having bleeding, she's having spotting, so that's intermenstrual bleeding. Postcoital bleeding is post-intercourse. If the patient bleeds, has spotting, that's postcoital bleeding. Postmenopausal bleeding. Menopause is once a woman becomes bleeding free, or she becomes amenorrheic for a period of at least 1 year. So that is called as menopause. So if a woman has attained menopause and then she bleeds, that's called as postmenopausal bleeding, and you need to check on that. So that's again a medical complication. Then menstrual pain, which is generally called as dysmenorrhea. How often do you, these are simple questions that you'd ask, how often do your periods come? When you ask about the cycles, then you'd be able to comprehend all these questions. You need to understand irregularity. Um, this is regular. For instance, if somebody has a cycle of 26 to 28 days or 29 days. So if one time she has 26-day cycle, the next time she has 28, 9-day cycle, this is a regular pattern. This is not irregular. So if this is her routine and it's followed, like if she always has 26-day cycle, this is not an abnormal cycle. If she's always had a 32, 33-day cycle, that's regular. But this is not irregular, this is not abnormality. Do they come early or do they come too late? By early, we means probably it's less than 24 days of cycle, or too late is beyond 35 days cycle. This is again, how do you bleed in between your periods? That's intermenstrual bleeding, which I already told you guys. Start as a full flow, that means your flow is normal, is heavy, is less. What is your... You always do ask. For instance, if a patient is presenting to you with menstrual irregularity or any kind of menstrual problem, you will always ask the patient that when was the last time that you had a normal regular cycle or a cycle without any symptoms that you have currently faced. I think that's also applicable to every kind of history taking, that you will always ask a patient that when you were feeling completely normal. So it's more or less the same thing. Okay, how do we assess how much a patient is bleeding? So basically, you need to ask how many pads does a patient change per day, what kind of pads is she using, is she using homemade towels, is she using sanitary pads, the thinness of the pads, is she certain patients would actually complain of menorrhagia that they're changing 5 to 6 pads per day, but actually they're hygiene conscious and they would change it regularly after every 2 to 3 hours. So that does not fulfill the criteria of menorrhagia or heavy menses. So you really need to get into the details of it and ask the patient. What is heavy for the patient? Is she passing any kind of clots along with the bleeding? How many pads are you changing? How often do you change? All these things are the same. Do you change at night? Yes. Somebody who would be bleeding heavily, there's a huge possibility that she might be completely soaked and wet while sleeping, and she might get up at the night, during night, to change her pad again. Do you pass clots, big, small? This is an important question. Do your period interfere with your life? That means if somebody is bleeding heavily, she might feel lethargic, tired because of anemia, and she might be bothered and irritable. Her quality of life might also be affected because of frequent changing of the pads, and she might even develop rash because of frequent heavy soaking of the pads. The other thing would also be dysmenorrhea. Dysmenorrhea also badly affects quality of life. A woman might lie down on bed and refrain from all her routine daily activities and take a lot of painkillers as well. So these are important questions that you would ask the patient. Have you had any accidents? I'm not sure what does that mean. Menorrhagia is heavy menstrual bleeding. Excessive menstrual loss. What is excessive menstrual loss? Large blood, frequently changing at night more than once, last longer than 7 days. That's also heavy menstrual bleeding. That means the general cycle is considered to be of 7 days. If somebody is bleeding beyond 7 days, so that is also included as menorrhagia. It's not important that the patient might be having a very heavy flow throughout, but she's bleeding for maybe 10 days every cycle. That also qualifies for menorrhagia. So we manage it accordingly. Okay, this I've already discussed. Causes iron deficiency, anemia. Other causes should be excluded. Patterns of abnormal menstrual loss could be menorrhagia, that is excessive menstrual loss at regular intervals. Metrorrhagia is frequent and irregular menstrual loss. Polymenorrhea, regular cycles of less than 21 days. That means a patient, the cycle's duration has really shortened. That means she's having repeated cycles. Her total cycle duration is 21, and this 21 days includes her bleeding period as well. When we talk about a cycle, the cycle is the bleed-free period along with the bleeding period. It includes the entire day. For instance, if 7 days that the duration where a patient would bleed, and she would re-bleed or she would have her menses again after a period of 22 days, so her cycle total would be of 29 days. A cycle is a calculation. It's an addition of the bleeding period along with the bleed-free period. So that's a cycle. if somebody's cycle is less than 21 days, that means she's bleeding very frequently. For instance, if she's having 7 days of bleeding, so her bleed-free period would only be 14 days. So that's a very frequent. That means she's bleeding after every 2 weeks. Oligomenorrhea is infrequent menstruation. It could be a cycle which is prolonged. That means she becomes bleeding free for 30 days or 29 days, and she just bleeds for 5 days, 6 days, or maybe even less. Intermenstrual bleeding, like I've already discussed, bleeding between 2 periods. Okay, so what is pelvic pain? Pelvic pain is constant chronic pain in the pelvis, and this is not related to your menstrual cycle. And the total period of pain to fulfill the criteria should be at least 6 months to call it as a chronic pelvic pain. So you get pain with your periods. If you're getting pain with your periods, it's dysmenorrhea. What is the worst day of the pain? How does the pain settle down? How does it increase? What kind of analgesics work on it? Resting works on it. Describe the pain, the intensity, the colicky, location. What are the aggravating and the relieving factors? So at least you should know that the pelvic pain is not because of UTI. It is not because of any bowel problem. It is not because of any other thing. So you should always ask the patient if there are any other associated symptoms. What are the relieving? What are the aggravating factors? If a patient has it along with intercourse, this is most likely dyspareunia. And dyspareunia is, please guys, just give me a second. I have a call from. Hello. Walaikum salam. बिल्कुल इंशाल्लाह ठीक. Hello. Yeah, sorry, I had a call from hospital. Okay, so dyspareunia could actually occur in cases of vaginismus. It can happen in endometriosis. It can happen in PID. So everything, if the patient has any of these complaints, you should have a provisional diagnosis. Of course, this is like your first gynae class, as you guys just mentioned that to me yesterday. So with time, you will understand what is the relevance of most of these questions and how can you relate them to any kind of provisional or differential diagnosis. So when you have any kind of provisional diagnosis in your mind, then you can have leading questions as well. Otherwise, you mostly leave open-ended question for the patient for the initial history, or at least for the presenting complaint, and then you go on to the leading question once you have a differential diagnosis in your mind. Nature and location, associated symptoms like menorrhagia again. Then again, this is what exactly I told you. Dysmenorrhea, if it's associated with menorrhagia, it's endometriosis, with discharge, PID, with fever again can be PID, weight loss or not can be TB as well. Then again, backache, lower backache can happen in UV prolapse, PID, chronic subacid, and endometriosis. These are all the differentials that you will keep in your mind if the patient is presenting to you with lower backache. So abdominal pain could be PID, could be endometriosis, could be an ectopic pregnancy, could be an abortion. Vaginal discharge is the most common complaint. You should always inquire the color of discharge, the consistency of the discharge, if it's associated with any kind of itching or not, if it is foul smelling or not, or the quantity it is. Its relation to intercourse as well is important. Any insertion of IUCD or any other kind of foreign body inserted inside the body. So all these things are really related to when your patient comes with vaginal discharge, so that you can come to a proper conclusion and diagnosis. And the number of the sexual partners is also important. Characteristics of the common vaginal discharge. Leukorrhea is just simple white pale discharge, not associated to foul smell, itching, irritation, and can usually occur almost throughout the cycle, but increases in the premenstrual period. Then bacterial vaginosis has a fishy odor, and it's one of the most common kind of presenting complaint when vaginal discharge comes. It is a gray, thin, homogeneous discharge. Might have itching and might not. And trichomonas vaginalis is usually a greenish kind of discharge. Candida vaginitis has severe pruritus, and it is curdy kind of a discharge. The white discharge is mostly like small piece, lumpy. So that's Candida. Pyogenic vaginitis could be again gonorrhea, chlamydia, all these things. Then foreign body insertion, if there's an IUCD in place, or in many cultures they might be inserting stuff that is causing all these problems. Trauma and neoplastic could be reason. One of the excessive purulent dirty discharge. Cervical cancer, endometrial cancer could be one of the reasons. Vaginal cancer could also be one of the reasons for these kind of dirty discharges. Mass in abdomen, what could be the possible differentials? Pregnancy, fibroid, ovarian tumors, tubo-ovarian masses, Hematometra. What is hematometra? Hematometra is collection of blood inside the uterine cavity. Hematocolpos is cervix. So it's basically collection of blood into the cervix. And full bladder could again be one of the reasons of having an abdominal mass. Okay, maturation and defecation difficulty. So this is basically more like the urogyne thing. How frequently do you void? Can you control the desire to void, or you nearly need to rush to the washroom? Do you leak on your way to the toilet? Do you leak when you cough, when you sneeze, when you're lifting stuff? Does that stress you in incontinence? Is your flow normal, or is it interrupted? Do you need to strain to pass urine? Is there some kind of hesitancy? Then difficulty in emptying bladder at some the same time. Have you ever been doing a retention? Do you have dysuria, burning, and all these kind of things? Hematuria, painful defecation, or constipation? These are the few questions that you would ask in gynae. They're all pertinent to gynae. Basically, urogynae. Then obtaining a sexual history, coital problems. Coital problems are usually discussed when patient presents with dyspareunia, one, and for infertility. So these are the two main reasons that you would discuss. Or even for post-coital bleeding, you would get into the details of the coital problems. Choose your words carefully. Of course, we have cultural stigma attached to these kind of questions. How long have you been in the current relationship? Is sexual intercourse occurring? Have you ever been in a relationship? When was the last relationship that you had? By relationship, it means more or less intercourse that we're talking about. So, but you just need to be very careful about the words. How many partners have you had in the period of time or before in your current relationship? What does you or your partner do to avoid pregnancy? So basically, they could be somebody could be using condoms, and condoms could cause latex allergy, and women could develop vaginal discharge secondary to that. So you need to know exactly what kind of contraception is being used. That could be a reason behind the vaginal discharge and pruritus. Does your partner travel? So these are few questions that you ask because they give you a hint. A partner who's traveling very frequently for very long durations, the chances of that partner being involved physically with somebody else are relatively higher. So you do ask these kind of questions when you're suspecting PID, especially. You do ask these questions. Or spend nights away from home, or have any other sexual partners. Or other coital problems. These are more pertinent to patients with infertility, failure of ejaculation, premature ejaculation, or reduced libido, impotence, unable to perform. I'm sure you guys know dyspareunia is painful intercourse. Then past gynecological history. What is important? Any other serious illness, any operations that were done in the past for pertinent to the gynecology or pelvic surgery, any gynecological operations on your tubes, ovaries, or uterus, any vaginal surgery, any curettes or the keyhole surgery performed. What is keyhole surgery? Is laparoscopy, okay? Any treatments to the cervix for pre-cancer changes. That means if your pap smear was done regularly, if there were any kind of changes in the pap smear, so any treatment was done to treat that or not. What was done in those operations? You need to know the details, exactly what has been done, if any pelvic surgery or any kind of intervention has been done in the past. What were you told about it? What was the last follow-up? All these things are important. Do you have regular pap test done? What was the last or where was it done? Then what was the result? Was there anything done about it? If there was any abnormality? Have you ever been treated for inflammation of the pelvis tubes? That is for PID. So basically, you'd ask if the patient has always. How do you ask this question? You can ask if the patient has had any history of dirty vaginal discharge, and she was given an antibiotic for at least a duration of 2 weeks, and her partner was also treated. So this is one of the things that would give you some idea that the patient had had PID in the past. And usually such patients who had PID have chronic pelvic pain on a long-term sequelae. They might have ectopic pregnancy. They might have difficulty in conceiving because of tubal blockage. Then past obstetric history. Any infertility treatment was done or not. The number of pregnancies and births. So basically this is just very briefly that you have to mention. Then drug history, you guys know if you have been taking any drugs in the past, any medical comorbidities, any hormones, any pills, any side effects to that. So at least now you know it and you can manage the patient accordingly. Any vitamins, minerals, supplements, or herbal remedies. For urine dysfunction, patients would present with nocturia as well. Nocturia is when you're sleeping at night and you would wake up just for the sake of passing urine. This is urgency, like I already mentioned, that can you control the desire to micturate, or you need to rush to the toilet and you might even leak on your way to toilet. For how long can you hold on to your urine? Do you ever get wet if you cough or sneeze? That is stress urinary incontinence. Do you have any difficulty emptying your bladder? That means if you're suspecting bladder outlet obstruction, or even prolapse can present with such symptoms. Any bladder infections like UTIs, any difficulty getting your bowels empty, that means patient might say that I have chronic constipation, or even patients with prolapse might have constipation, might not have constipation, but they have a rectal prolapse for which they have to push onto the vaginal wall, which is bulging out to empty their bowel or empty their bladder. What happens when you strain? Does anything come out? Can you control your flatus? If you cannot, that will give you this idea of the strength of the pelvic floor muscles and even of the sphincter. Then what are the pertinent questions that you do ask if a patient presents to you with infertility? The number of the months that patient has been exposed to the possibility of getting pregnant. This is a very important question because sometimes patient presents to you with a case of infertility, but she says that I'm married for 10 years, but you really need to get in the details. 10 years doesn't mean that she's been infertile for 10 years. In those 10 years, it's possible that the husband might is abroad for 6 years, or maybe for even 8 years. Or maybe husband is abroad and he just comes back for a month every year. And then patient says, I've married for 10 years. But basically, the chances of her being pregnant has only been for those 10 months that the husband has visited back in Pakistan. Or maybe she was taking some kind of contraception earlier, and then she's only planning to conceive for the last few months. So that does not really fulfill the criteria of that woman being infertile. So it's very important. Take a careful contraceptive history, again, like I mentioned. Other useful question could be, have you ever been pregnant at all, like any miscarriage or not? And if any of the partners has had a prior marriage and has had children with that earlier partner. That's an important question. That means if a female was married earlier and this is a remarriage and she has a child with in the earlier marriage, that means the chances of her being infertile are less and the male having problems are higher. Likewise, the male, if he was married early and has had children with another woman, the chances of male factor infertility are less in this case. And the frequency of intercourse is very important again. And if there are any problems related to intercourse like dyspareunia, premature ejaculation, or anything of that sort. Then family and social history, like history of communicable disease in the family. If somebody's got a TB, the chances of pelvic TB are higher. History of metabolic diseases, endocrinology, diabetes, all these things. Polycystic ovarian syndrome. This can run in families as well. Cancers, other hereditary diseases, smoking. Yeah, that's about it. So we're done with the gynae history. Thank you, and we can take questions, or I can complete the gynae terminology session and then we can take the questions all together. I think that would be a better idea. Let me get to the terminology part. So the common terminology that you'd use in gynecology would be like miscarriage. What is miscarriage? Is a spontaneous ending of the pregnancy. And this occurs before, like I mentioned, 24 weeks of viability. So anything before 24 weeks happens is fulfilling the criteria of a miscarriage. Miscarriage has many types. It has threatened, inevitable, complete miscarriage, incomplete miscarriage. So there are further types of that as well. What is threatened miscarriage? Threatened miscarriage is that the patient might be bleeding or might have pain during pregnancy, but her pregnancy is not aborted. She hasn't aborted, and the baby is viable and everything is going fine. So that's basically just threatened abortion. You would ask patient to rest, maybe give her hormonal supplements and continue the pregnancy. That incomplete abortion is when the os is open and the patient has partly passed the product of conception and partly retained them. Complete miscarriage is when a patient has completely passed out the products of conception and her uterine cavity is empty. That's complete. Then there's a missed miscarriage. In missed miscarriage, the patient's pregnancy was viable initially, but then the heartbeat is lost and the complete fetus and everything is inside, the os is closed. That's called as missed miscarriage. Gravida, we discussed that yesterday, gravida and parity. What is multigravida? A woman who has been pregnant earlier as well. So basically second and more pregnancies. Contraception is a birth control method. Ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy that is occurring outside the normal uterine cavity. It can be in the tubes, it can be the ovaries, it can be in the pelvis, it can be anywhere else. Okay? So that is ectopic pregnancy. Anywhere outside the normal uterine cavity would fulfill the criteria of ectopic pregnancy. Hysterectomy is the removal of the uterus. Tubal ligation is basically removal of the tubes or ligating the tubes or applying clips to the tube for the purpose of contraception. It's a permanent method of contraception. Subfertility is when a couple, after unprotected intercourse, is unable to conceive for 1 year or 2 years, because in certain certain guidelines they say only 1 year is good enough, but certain guidelines say that 2 years is the criteria to fulfill subfertility or infertility. And again, it can be primary and secondary. What is primary subfertility? That means somebody has never conceived, no miscarriage, no pregnancy, nothing. And secondary subfertility is when a patient has had an earlier pregnancy which ended up in a miscarriage or which had a normal delivery, but now she has become infertile after that last pregnancy. So that is secondary infertility or subfertility. In menstrual cycle, menarche is the aging onset of the menstrual cycle. Amenorrhea is lack of menstruation. Lack of menstruation can either be primary or secondary. What is primary amenorrhea? Primary amenorrhea is when a woman has not had menstrual cycle for a period of 6 months. And what is secondary amenorrhea? Secondary amenorrhea is when a woman has not had any menstrual cycle. Sorry, my bad. Primary amenorrhea is when a woman has never had menstrual cycle. She's never reached the age of menarche. And secondary amenorrhea is when a woman had her menses, but now she's become amenorrheic for any reason. So if that duration falls into 1 year period, that is called as menopause. But it's postmenopause or bleeding, like I mentioned earlier, rather bleeding after cessation of the menses after menopause. LMP is the first day of the last menstrual period. Dysmenorrhea is painful menstruation. Menorrhagia is heavy menstrual bleeding. Oligomenorrhea is less menstrual flow or maybe the prolonged cycle. Intermenstrual bleeding is bleeding in between 2 menstrual cycles. COE is combined oral contraceptive pills, which is a combination of estrogen and progesterone, and the doses and the types of estrogen and progesterone may vary. HRT is a hormone replacement therapy, which is usually given in the perimenopausal and the postmenopausal female because they would develop symptoms of lack of female hormones, like hot flushes, osteoporosis, cardiac problems, and dryness of vagina, urinary issues, all these problems. PID or STI is basically pelvic inflammatory disease. And this is basically ascending vaginal infections, which can affect the genital tracts, affect the uterus, the ovaries, and even the pelvic cavity. OI is ovulation induction. Ovulation induction is an artificial technique or artificial method of inducing pregnancy in a woman, of an infertile couple. So that is called as ovulation induction. This is usually done with medicines, but can be usually done with medicines in the form of drugs, but can be injections can also be used. And if we get into advanced technique, then we can say IVF and IVF, all these procedures can further be a gamete. These are all further advanced types of ovulation induction or artificial reproductive techniques. Thank you. And now we can take the questions. So let me go to question section. Leukorrhea is just a normal white vaginal discharge, and it's because of the routine hormonal effects on a female. So normal regular cycle in any, it's not abnormal, it's a normal thing. Which questions are we talking about? How do we phrase these questions in Urdu for the patient? Like discharge, you'd probably ask के कोई पानी की शिकायत तो नहीं है, किस किस्म का पानी आता है, बदबूदार है, खारिश वाला है, इस तरह के क्वेश्चन हो सकते हैं. क्या इससे आपके शोहर से मिलने के बाद बढ़ जाता है, क्या मेंसेस आने से पहले बढ़ जाता है, महवारी कहते हैं उसको उर्दू में. Okay, if you want to know the Urdu terminology for that. What is the importance of asking urinary urgency during history taking? Because when you're taking gynae history and a patient either you can just simply say कि कोई पेशाब में मसला तो नहीं है, जलन दर्द तकलीफ तो नहीं है, या पेशाब के काबू करने में मसला तो नहीं है, या पेशाब निकल तो नहीं जाता, because all these urinary problems are part of gynecology. This is urogynecology. That's my specialty. So that's all part is subspecialty of gynecology. So like oncology is one of them. So basically it's all related because the genitourinary system is all linked. It's all together. So that's why it's important in the gynae history. And if you need to get into the details of urgency and incontinence and stress or whatever if patient has urinary problems. Otherwise, you can just simply ask कि पेशाब में कोई तकलीफ जलन दर्द तो नहीं है, पेशाब को निकल तो नहीं जाता, पेशाब काबू करने में कोई मसला तो नहीं है, बार बार तो नहीं आता. Just 2-3 questions. That's it. If a patient has some complaint, then you need to get into detail of it. Because PCOS, like polycystic ovarian syndrome, it's basically a chronic illness. It's more like diabetes and hypertension. So it requires a lifestyle change. It requires a lot of weight loss. It requires a lot of correction of the hormonal status. So if her fasting insulin level is not corrected, if her weight is not corrected, all these things, so cycles will never get regular. So more or less, most of these women do require hormonal supplements for very long duration. For a duration of 3 months or 6 months is not good enough. They might need it for longer or maybe even in interrupted periods. Some women respond very well to weight reduction. If they lose their weight very well and their fasting insulin level goes down, they do even respond to glucophage if taken for a very long period. So there are few things that can be done and patient can get better with that. But it's something that you can say is a chronic state. It requires a lot of, like, diabetes can be controlled if your sugar intake is controlled, if your lifestyle has been changed. So diabetes can be controlled with that, but diabetes not be cured. So it's more or less something of that sort. So it's not completely like cured of anything, but it can be improved and it can be controlled. And things can fall back into normal routine as well. Well, subfertility, fertility, just it's the same thing. It's just the difference of the terminology that is used. Generally, infertility, and but just to make it a little less painful for the patient, subfertility is used. That's my understanding of it. Because people in the West, they do want to be very gentle with the patient, and calling somebody an infertile person, male or female, is way more harsh, rude, rather than calling subfertility. I mean, you are fertile, but you just have a little bit of reduced fertility. So it's just a little bit of, like what an empathetic kind of a terminology. Therefore, miscarriage is that a patient had a viable pregnancy earlier on, but that later on become the heartbeat is lost, and the fetus is completely inside the uterus. She has not evacuated. She just goes for a routine fetal heart rate checkup and a routine ultrasound, and it is found out that the patient's pregnancy has been lost. Usually, these patients are asymptomatic, but they might have some kind of brownness discharge or spotting, and that is one of the indications or one of the reasons that you would pick up miscarriage. So that is miscarriage. Then secondary infertility. Secondary infertility is if a woman had conceived earlier, that pregnancy ended in miscarriage, ectopic, normal delivery, whatever, is refractory or is besides the point. But now if she fails to conceive after that last pregnancy, whatever the end of that pregnancy was, whatever the conclusion was, whatever the outcome was, it's besides the point. But if she fails to conceive after that, at least for a period of 1 year, then that is fulfilling the criteria of secondary infertility. So primary is जो कि initial से ही infertile, who never conceived initially. So this is basically the difference between primary and secondary. Subfertility, I told you, inability to conceive है because of problem feature. Polycystic ovarian syndrome is basically a problem of a gynecologist. But they do specialize in hormones as well. And endocrinologist is also not a wrong choice or a wrong person to go to. But a gynecologist is the right domain, is the specialist for this problem. Any more questions, guys? देखो पीकॉस की अगर बात हो रही है, पॉलिसिस्टिक ओवेरियन सिंड्रोम, इसका फर्टिलिटी पे बहुत इफेक्ट होता है. इट कैन बिकॉज ऑफ द हार्मोनल imbalance that a woman has. She might have an ovulatory cycle. That means there is no ovulation. If there is no ovulation, she will not conceive. So it has a lot of implications. And even if she conceives, the chances of her having a miscarriage are higher because of luteal phase deficiency. That means the progesterone level after ovulation will also be less in such cases. So the best way of managing is that if somebody has polycystic ovarian syndrome and she's been started on glucophage for that, she should continue glucophage during the time when she's trying to conceive, and also during her pregnancy for a certain period of time. Some people would probably recommend it for a couple of months initially and some till the end, because her hormones are controlled in that, in with the medicine. I don't know. There's nobody. I have a hand free on. How can I have background noises? It's strange. So, anyone has more questions? Any more questions, guys? Maybe my scarf is touching this thing. Maybe. No, surgery is not the only option for fibroids. It depends on what are the symptoms associated with fibroids. If a woman has fibroids causing anorexia, we can try medical treatment first and then move on to surgical treatment. And then in surgical treatment, we do have option of uterine embolization. That's something which is new. In Western world, like in the research has been done on the MRI management of fibroids. However, we haven't started doing it over here. It's being done abroad. We don't do it over here. We have medicines like which are progesterone receptor blockers, like ulipristal acetate. These are also new drugs which are being introduced, and they cause the reduction in the size of the fibroids and the reduction in the bleeding associated with fibroids. However, medical treatment will not cure fibroids, or medical treatment will just give you symptomatic relief. So with fibroids, basically, especially if they're small size and they're not causing any kind of pressure symptoms on your urinary system or pain or pressure or anything which really needs a surgical intervention, you don't really need to do surgery for fibroids until they're large enough fibroids and they are causing submucosal fibroids which are into the endometrial cavity. They're large and they're causing a lot of bleeding, causing anemia and requiring transfusion. So I think surgical candidates are such patients. Otherwise, it can be, we can do a medical management. Trial of medical management can be done. And if the size is less than 4 centimeter, then a hormonal contraceptive device can also be placed for fibroids, and that is also very effective. But then again, if somebody is refractory to medical treatment, then surgical procedure is the thing to be done. Any more questions? And for small fibroid, you need nothing. Small fibroids of maybe 1 centimeter, 2 centimeter, or something like that, it's not even a big deal. Forget it. I think when 3, 4 centimeters is not a big deal unless the patient is really symptomatic for it. Any more questions? Guys, any more questions? Guys, any more questions? Any more questions? Any more questions? Somebody. Yes, a fibroid can increase in size, but it is usually very slow and over a very long duration because fibroid is an estrogen stimulated tumor. So a female, till the time she doesn't get menopausal, there are chances of it increasing, especially in pregnancy. It might increase more rapidly as compared to a routine, but it's usually very slow, very 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 slow. If some fibroid is growing rapidly एकदम fibroid appear होगा, बहुत ही large हो गया, so then the chances of that fibroid having sarcomatous changes, that is, chances of it being malignant, are higher. Although it's something very 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 rare, maybe 1 in 1,000 or maybe less, very rare possibility. ये कहाँ से सवाल आ रहे हैं यार, तो kidney stones affect the pregnancy, miscarriage or abortion? Not that I know of. Kidney stones can cause UTI, and UTI can cause miscarriages. UTI can be one of the triggering factors for miscarriages and for preterm delivery, for IUGR as well, for anemia as well. So UTI is related indirectly or has some association with all these pregnancy-related complications. The renal stone directly will not be having an implication. However, it can cause a lot of pain and discomfort because of hydronephrosis or hydroureter if it's an obstructive stone. Or if a patient is having recurrent UTI, again, that could be secondary to stones and that should be removed then. And that could be one of the reasons. Otherwise, one or two tiny stones, which is really less than 4 mm, non-obstructive, and asymptomatic, doesn't really matter. Will not have any effect on pregnancy if required. That asymptomatic, that means no UTI, nothing at all, no hematuria. Anything else? Guys, any more questions? Shall we end the session? Guys, any more questions? Shall we end the session?